These images probably come to mind when you think of New York icons. Today's guest is another. He is as recognizable as these icons, and his name as synonymous with the Big Apple. He has been part of the New York media landscape for 33 years and has brought New York and the region with their stories into your homes every weekday evening. Chuck Scarborough, an Emmy Award-winning NBC anchor and correspondent. Scarborough, with News Channel 4 since 1974, is the co-anchor of New York's #1 rated 11 p.m. newscast and is currently anchoring solo a new 7 p.m. newscast. He has received 30 Emmy Awards and continually delivers high-profile reports for the station. A recent 4-part series, Enemies No More, told the story of 3 soldiers in the Battle of the Bulge. A commercial pilot, Scarborough has also hosted several programs, including the hour-long show Touching the Sky, which celebrated the centennial of flight. Scarborough has received several awards from the Associated Press and won the Washington Review of Journalism's Best in the Business Award in 1984 and the Working Press Association Terry Anderson Award in '92. He supports and hosts many charitable events related to literacy, animals, and the environment. Our guest this evening is Mr. Chuck Scarborough with News Channel 4 in New York. Thanks so much for being here this evening. We really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be here again.
We've got a few questions we'd like to pose, if that's okay.
Fire away.
So we'll get started. The 7 p.m. newscast, it's a really interesting concept. A lot of people just aren't home in time for the earlier newscasts, so it seemed to be a great idea. How's it faring, ratings-wise, response-wise?
It's doing well, and we're building an audience. We aren't #1 in the time slot yet, but we're being patient about that. And we decided to do that because we simply weren't getting the audience we used to get at 5 o'clock. That audience either isn't there or it's watching something else. It's not watching us. So we decided to basically shift everything half an hour. And we felt that the 7 o'clock slot was much better for people getting home, people working. They could come in and get a good hard look at the news and have some alternative for the metropolitan area to entertainment.
Right. So you've gotten a good response thus far?
Oh yes, very good response. Most people are grateful to have a newscast on at that time. We've got to get them all to watch now.
Right.
On a regular basis.
Right. Speaking of which, Sue Simmons, who's been your partner on air for, I think, 27 years.
Yes.
How does it feel to sort of go solo for this 7 p.m. newscast?
Well, I'm still with Sue at 11 o'clock, so we haven't gotten a divorce yet. I get my daily dose of Sue, which is enough, actually. 1 broadcast a day. Briefly, I did 2 broadcasts a day with her.
Right.
She did the 6 with me, just briefly. But through most of those years, she did the 5 o'clock broadcast. I did the 6 with somebody else, and then the 11 o'clock was Sue Simmons. But I'm sort of back to my regular daily one shot of Sue, and that's dangerous enough.
You've been obviously covered hundreds of news stories over the years. Do you have any that you can name that are among your favorite?
Oh boy, there's so many different categories of stories that I've covered everything, from the whole spectrum of stories over the last almost 40 years in broadcast journalism. And I suppose the one that's closest to my heart is one about my own father that I did back in the 1980s. It's going to take a bit of time, but it's a story that means a great deal to me. I'll tell it to you if you'd like.
I'd love to. I'd love to hear it.
My father was a B-17 pilot in the Second World War, and he was shot down on his 5th mission. He bailed out with his crew behind enemy lines and in Yugoslavia, escaped from behind enemy lines after 2 weeks behind enemy lines, and then got back to his own base, flew 20 more missions. And so this was a story that I'd heard all my life, this great war story of my dad's. And we had back, I think it was 1987 or 88, we had a little kicker at the end of our 6 o'clock broadcast, which is a light little piece. Somebody restored a B-17 and they flew, it was the 4th of July, and they flew it ceremonially down the Hudson River and around the Statue of Liberty and back up. And it was a good little 20-second voiceover at the end of the broadcast before we said goodnight. My co-anchor, who was Pat Harper at the time, said, "Boy, that's a beautiful airplane, isn't it?" And I said, "Well, yes, my father flew one of those, and he was shot down in his 5th mission. He got back, escaped, and flew 20 more missions, and has told me that story for a long, long time." My phone was ringing in my office when I got upstairs. And it was a fellow named Joe Couric who told me that when he heard me say that, the hair stood up on his arms, that he had wondered for the last 20 years if I was related to the Chuck Scarborough he had been shot down with over Yugoslavia in 1944. And he had with him, he was the Volturret gunner on that mission. My father was a substitute. He subbed in as co-pilot on that mission, and so he flew that one ill-fated mission with that crew and never saw them again. When they all got back, he picked up his own aircraft and never saw them. Joe Couric had a diary, a daily diary. He had Yugoslavian currency signed by all 11 members of the crew. They had a combat photographer on board that flight, that mission. The combat photographer had taken maybe 100 high-quality black and white photos behind enemy lines of all of them. Joe Couric had those. So suddenly I had all this evidence of this story I'd heard all my life from my dad. And I arranged a reunion. With my brother as the photographer. He was an NBC News photojournalist. And I got Joe Couric in from Brooklyn and my dad in from the Midwest, and they met for the first time in 44 years, embraced each other and began to tell these stories and relive their big adventure behind enemy lines. It was just a very touching story, very well illustrated. So I suppose that one is nearest and dearest, but going beyond the personal touch, you sort of love the one you're with, whatever you're doing most recently. And most recently I did a story in New Orleans on the USS New York, which was a wonderful story. There's a brand new Navy ship being built, a ship that's designed to carry a full complement of 800 combat Marines and all of their equipment, everything they need to go 500 miles inland, and basically it's an anti-terror aircraft. It can go off and attack terror bases. They took 20-some tons, 24 tons of World Trade Center steel to a little smelter in Amite, Louisiana, melted it down to form the bow stem on this new ship, the part of the ship that cuts the water, that leads the way. And the ship is probably a year away from being commissioned, but it's completed. The last major assembly was on it a few months ago. So I went down to cover that story, to tell people about the USS New York, about what it meant to us in the New York area, that the World Trade Center was going on the offensive, that had been destroyed by terrorists, and what it meant to these tough shipyard workers and these really gritty steel mill workers who work some of the hardest jobs in the world. They're hot, dangerous jobs, and every one of them, from the foundry in Amite, Louisiana, to the shipyard in New Orleans, were moved almost beyond their own ability to recount by this experience of melting down that steel from the World Trade Center and pouring it into what would become a weapon in the war on terror.
Both very emotional stories.
Yeah.
That's great. Again, you've been in New York for 30 plus years, I think.
33, almost 34. Coming up 34th anniversary.
Okay. And again, obviously covered many stories. And you've been in the city, obviously, for that, that length of time. There have been lots of changes over the course of the last 30 plus years.
Yes, sure.
What are some of the biggest that you've seen, experienced, both good and bad?
Well, the city continues to evolve in interesting and generally positive ways. Not long after I got here, New York went bankrupt. The city was plunged into bankruptcy in 1986, and suddenly local government was superseded by the Municipal Assistance Corporation. We had a fellow named Felix Roten, who was a financier, basically running the city, calling the shots, renegotiating contracts. It was a very gloomy time, and there were actually people thinking that New York was just going to collapse and fold and would no longer be a significant city on the face of the earth. That it was too deeply in debt and unnecessary and too crime-ridden and too expensive. Well, we know what happened. The city rebounded very dramatically, and by the bicentennial, when the tall ships came cruising into the Hudson River, it was already on the way back, and it rose to new heights. It was going through a period for a while in the 80s of crime that was driving people out.
Right.
That was rectified, and it's gone through a period of great prosperity now. I don't know what lies ahead, but the city does seem to keep its vitality, and in my view, it's still a tremendous magnet for people who are creative in any field, any endeavor.
And you spoke of the rebound. What do you attribute that most to? I mean, obviously there was a change in government and...
Well, I think, to be fair to Mayor Rudy Giuliani, I think that he had a lot to do with taking a look at what was causing this terrible crime problem. If you're talking about what made the city safer, the city was already economically back.
Right.
When Rudy Giuliani was elected mayor. Ed Koch had done a very good job of bringing the city back and riding herd in the city. David Dinkins was a bit less effective, a very nice man, and a fellow I see once a year at the U.S. Open. We always enjoy chatting politics, but his tenure as mayor was a little less impressive than the man who preceded and followed him. But when Rudy Giuliani instituted this notion, I think the theory was called the broken window theory. That is, if you ignore a broken window, vandals will ultimately destroy the house. So the city's theory back then was, before the Giuliani administration, was we're going to put all of our resources on really dangerous crimes and ignore the little stuff. We're going to focus on violent crimes, street robberies, murders, sexual crimes, and forget about the car windows being smashed, the radios being stolen, and petty thievery, and all these little, and the squeegee guys racing out in the traffic, and all of these little things, turnstile jumpers, let them go, let's not waste resources on that. So when the entire philosophy was changed, suddenly by cracking down on the little stuff, you were cleaning up big stuff. A lot of the guys who were jumping turnstiles were also guys who were doing armed robberies. A lot of the guys who were smashing and grabbing radios out of cars were also doing armed robberies and worse. So you were cleaning up the streets pretty rapidly under that program. There was more to it than that. I mean, he introduced accountability in various commanders in the precincts and other things that under Bill Bratton, who was the police commissioner, who would then go on to Los Angeles, did a good job cleaning the city up.
Right. And obviously Rudy's moved on to other things.
Yes, Rudy is primarily capitalizing on his performance after 9/11.
Right, right.
He was certainly getting mixed reviews up to that point in office. People liked the crime fighting part. They didn't necessarily like some of the things he had done during his rise to power. So there were people who he wasn't universally loved up until 9/11. After 9/11, he was, certainly, and some of the luster is worn off, but a lot remains, and he is, to this day, way out front in the Republican pack.
Yes.
Nobody's close.
We won't go ahead, though, and ask you to comment on where your expectations are, but in terms of the presidential election. But I think we're actually going to move on to some more personal questions. Okay. You're a commercial pilot. You have a commercial pilot's license, actually. Have you ever thought about sort of scrapping the news business and becoming a pilot?
Oh, I suppose in some Walter Mitty fantasy, I must have had that thought. But no, I enjoy what I do immensely.
Okay. And
by the way, that's been very handy. The commercial pilot stuff, the knowledge of aviation is very handy because that plays very frequently into the news. And I think also the disciplines of being a pilot help. The analytical disciplines of looking at a problem, breaking it down, and trying to solve it helped me in many occasions. When on 9/11, when the World Trade Center was hit, it helped me sort of organize my thoughts and analyze what was going on and draw on whatever knowledge I had about physics and what happens to steel when it's heated and why you have insulation on structures that are made of steel to prevent steel from losing its structural strength. So there were people, as you recall, speculating that there had to have been other explosives to bring the building straight down after the initial plane hits. Because of, pardon me, a little more disciplined analytical approach, I avoided falling into that pitfall, that trap.
Right. So you were able to tap into that experience and
yeah, that and all the years of reporting and covering things and learning these kind of oddball things about. I've done a story on on a controversy over the insulation on the steel at the Javits Center. Years before, it was one of these great investigative pieces where it was sort of a David and Goliath story where David was the bad guy, and as it turned out, but there was a controversy over over what was being used to insulate the steel in the Javits Center when it was being built. Now, before that, I didn't even understand. I didn't know the steel had to be insulated, but I learned it at that point. And that little factoid kind of stuck and it became useful later on.
That's great. So yeah, it does come in handy.
Yeah.
Okay, the other thing is that I've discovered about you, Mr. Scarborough, is that you're also an author. You have 3 published novels, and I was wondering, because many people may not know that, if you could tell me a little bit about them, and do you have plans for a 4th?
No, I don't think so. I think the work-reward ratio has proved to be pretty awful in writing novels, and I did, the first 2 were set in the world of television. The first novel I wrote was a novel called Striker, and it was about a television newsman gone bad, strange as that may sound, and who became a sort of a Manchurian Candidate character who was manipulated by higher forces to do a dastardly deed, and almost succeeded. Having made the mistake of letting some pretty vile characters survive that novel, I wrote a sequel to it, a standalone sequel called The Myrmidon Project, again set in the world of television. And it, pardon me, it anticipated the digital age when you could actually create characters out of electrons instead of having to hire expensive talent. You could actually create the sort of the perfect anchor and adjust the anchor accordingly. You know, do some audience surveys and adjust the anchor's attitude, hair color, eye color, skin tones as the audience taste changed. And that was kind of a fun thing, which ultimately I think was stolen by the creator of Max Headroom. I think I was pilfered on that one. And then years went by, and I did a series of reports in 1986 on the earthquake danger in New York. It was after an Armenian earthquake. Well, not too awful a magnitude. It was, I think, it's a 7 on the Richter scale. That killed an awful lot of people because in Armenia, in the area where the quake was, they lived in unreinforced masonry structures. So the buildings fell down and that killed people. Earthquakes aren't very dangerous unless you're in a man-made structure. You know, you get a little bumpy ride out there on the ground. If you're in something that falls down, then you get killed. So it opened the door for a lot of seismologists and scientists to say, we've been warning you guys about New York for a long time and nobody's been listening, but you see what happens? Because 56% of the buildings in New York City are unreinforced masonry, all these brownstones, all these mid-rise buildings up to 30 stories, slab and column. You pour a slab of concrete, put columns up, another slab of concrete, columns up. They're not steel structures. You start moving that laterally and they come down like a deck of cards. So I did a series of reports on the fact that New York was not a seismically dead area. There are many fault lines on the east coast of the United States. They're not as active as the ones on the west coast, which lie along the border of 2 tectonic plates, but there are tremendous earthquakes that happen mid-plate. In fact, the worst in history was one that happened in the center of the country, the New Madrid Fault, right in the center of the country, right through Missouri. And it was in the 1890s, I think, somewhere around toward the end of the 19th century. And it actually rang church bells in Boston and in San Francisco. That's how ferocious that was. So anyway, with fault lines trending through tunnels and near the Indian Point nuclear power plant and across 125th Street in Manhattan, it was a scary scenario, terrifying scenario. And I could illustrate it with all kinds of things an earthquake would do that happened in New York without benefit of an earthquake. You know, gas pipe explosions, high-rise collapses, all kinds of things that have happened, flooding in the subways, chaos in a blackout. We had all that footage, so it turned out to be a really scary series, and the editor of my previous novel called me up and said exactly what we need. We need a disaster novel. We need you to write Bonfire of the Vanities after an earthquake. So that became then Aftershock, which I guess was the most successful novel. It was ultimately a CBS miniseries, so I ended up competing with myself one grading period.
Yeah, that was an
on,
unfortunate choice of network.
My aftershock was on CBS, and I
Right.
fell on NBC. So.
I guess, to wrap,
Uh-huh.
Brian Williams is the guest of honor for tonight's
Yes,
ball. You are
yeah.
the master of ceremonies, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
You have a long history, I believe, with Brian. If you
I do, yeah.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about the relationship, and also what is it about Brian? What qualities make him the success that he is today?
Well, I've known Brian for 25 years. Brian and I met in Washington National Airport. I may mention this tonight, now that you bring it up. But he was in his early 20s. He was working at the National Association of Broadcasters, and came up to me, introduced himself, said he watched me in New York, and I was coming back from an assignment in Washington, and asked me if I would be so kind as to give him some advice on how to get into broadcast journalism and have a good career in broadcast journalism. So as it turned out, the plane was delayed, and we spent quite a bit of time talking, and I found him to be a very earnest, bright, interesting young man who was certainly worthy of trying to mentor a bit to try to help him along. So in the early years of his career, I looked at his tapes and kind of gave him some advice, and others did as well. And eventually, he moved rather smartly up through several markets, landed in New York at WCBS. We hired him at NBC. He was our White House correspondent, got his own show on MSNBC for a while, and then was named the seventh man in the history of the universe to be the anchor and managing editor of NBC Nightly News. He got that job because Brian is probably the hardest working newsman I know. He's extremely bright. He has as an aside, it isn't terribly useful in the evening news, but he has a razor sharp wit. He has a diabolical sense of humor, which you may see tonight. But he has been dedicated to broadcast journalism since as it turns out, since he was a boy. I mean, this was his ambition. And as unlikely as it is for any one human being to start out somewhere, in his case in New Jersey, and rise to end up sitting in one of 3 chairs at the apex of the pyramid of broadcast journalism. He did it. He did it because he's a terrific broadcast journalist. He has towering integrity, and he's a lot of fun.
That's great.
He's a good friend, too.
Well,
is he standing back there? Is that where you're looking?
I think
Brian?
he is, actually.
Yeah, okay. Well, if I'd known that, I wouldn't have been so generous with my
No,
comments.
thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful. It's been
pleasure.
great to meet you. Thank you,
Thank you,
Mr. Scarborough.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.